Hello, cruel world. My name is Dr. Sohom. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist and I assess and rehabilitate mentally disordered offenders. So you don't have to. Today I'm going to talk about the case of Alek Minassian, who ran over 26 pedestrians and killed 10 of them. So this happened on the streets of Toronto about 2 years ago, and I first heard about it on Twitter. People reached out and they wanted to know my opinion because I've assessed dozens of people with autism, some of whom have committed serious crimes, and I act as an expert witness, so I inform courts. So I've talked about autism in my previous episodes, especially episode 1. I talked about the incident where a man called John Terry Bravery with autism randomly picked up and threw off a little boy, random French tourist, off a balcony. But going back to the case of Minassian, it's quite a controversial case, and I note that a couple of charities have spoken out against what the psychiatrist said in court. This included Autism Canada. Specifically what they said, and I quote, is that they publicly denounced the egregious claims made by a defence counsel psychiatrist who attributed Minassian's actions to his autistic way of thinking, saying that it was severely distorted, similar to psychosis. And then some other people who've spoken out for autism pointed out that there's no psychosis as a diagnosis in autistic spectrum disorder, and also that the average person with autism has no more tendency to act in an antisocial manner than the general population. And also some autistic charities have spoken out just generally wanting to act against the negative perception of people with autistic spectrum disorder. So I'm going to talk about all of these issues within this video, and I'm going to tell you my opinion. Before then, I'm just going to briefly tell you about my YouTube series. Are you interested in true crime? What about mental illness? Why not both? Welcome to A Psych for Sore Minds, the only YouTube series that I'm aware of that intersects the crossroads of the two. I'm your host, Dr. Sohom. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist and I live and work in London. So I assess and rehabilitate mentally disordered offenders in prisons and in courts and in secure psychiatric units. And as I mentioned before, I also work as a formal expert witness. I give evidence in criminal trials across the UK. So this channel that you're watching, A Psych for Sore Minds, dissects a whole range of mental health topics, some of which are related to offending and violence, but some are not. Some are more familiar to the average person. Okay, so let's get back to this case. First, I'm going to tell you a bit of background about Minassian. So as I said, Alek Minassian struck 26 pedestrians and he killed 10 of them. And it does seem, at least on the surface, that this was deliberate. It was pre-planned. He went and he hired the van intentionally with the plan to run over and kill these people. In terms of his background, he was apparently bullied at school, and he'd also been specifically researching spree killers or mass murderers. And he has overtly stated that he's been fantasizing about school shootings and other mass murders. In fact, he looked into the background of Elliot Rodger. I think they discovered this from his internet searches. So Elliot Rodger was a man who stabbed, shot, and also ran over 6 people to death before taking his own life in 2014. So Minassian did some background research on Rodger. He read his manifesto, and that manifesto is seen by some to be like a Bible for the incel population. Minassian struggled with relationships and also struggled with general loneliness, and he seemed to have a hatred of being rejected by females. People have looked into his past, including during the trial, and there's been a few incidents which reflect this, including one well-known incident where he approached a female in a college library and was rejected, and obviously took this to heart. So as I said, his trial has been going on recently in Canada, and he pleaded not guilty, claiming that he should have been found not criminally responsible because he reckons his autism prevented him from rationally knowing what he was doing was wrong. Now, the reason I'm speaking up about this case is this is exactly the kind of case that I assess as a forensic psychiatrist, and I give evidence in court, and I will give you my opinion later. What I would say though is that Minassian's actions seem to show that it was deliberate and it was pre-planned. He told the court and the psychiatrist that he had actually considered buying a gun to kill all these people, but decided that it'd be easier to hire a van. And he even said to the psychiatrist, and this is pretty damning, that he wished he had run over more attractive young females that day. And apparently the way he described his actions was a very cold and monotonous manner. And he clearly stated that he wanted to have shock value and that he's glad that he got people's attention by what he did. He also told the psychiatrist that it was worth it. Of note, Minassian, when he was assessed, he was said to have at least average to high intelligence. And just as a side note, he apparently tried to commit suicide whilst on remand in jail by drinking soap. An interesting point is that the psychiatrist was asked in court if Minassian would be capable of understanding the magnitude of the upset and the distress he had caused, and the psychiatrist said no, he probably didn't. However, she also said, and I quote, he absolutely knew it was against the law. So after the break, I'm going to talk you through some of the medico-legal issues of this case. So the first and the main question, I think, is, was Minassian criminally responsible? So it is really important to understand that criminal responsibility as a concept is a completely separate entity from just the diagnosis of mental illness, even though the diagnosis can cause a lapse of criminal responsibility. What I'm trying to say is that a person can have a very severe mental illness, whether that's depression, autism, psychosis, such as hearing voices, personality disorder, but yet they still have criminal responsibility. In fact, I'd even go further to say that most people that I see in criminal court who do have a mental illness also do have criminal responsibility. So the threshold to not have this responsibility, for example, to be found not guilty by reason of insanity, is high. It takes a lot to cross that threshold and to be found non-responsible. I should also point out that the law is different in Canada. It's the whole concept is called not criminally responsible as opposed to not guilty by reason of insanity. So I was following this case on Twitter, and there's a lot of people that are suggesting that Minassian has been exaggerating his symptoms of mental illness and that his father is complicit by really stressing to the court the symptoms that Minassian has. And other people have been saying that he shouldn't be using autism as an excuse. When it comes to criminal responsibility, it's not just the diagnosis, it's actually about the person's intent at that moment in time. Again, I've discussed this at length in my episode about John T. Bravery, my very first episode of A Psych for Sore Minds, so check it out. So obviously it goes without saying that I've not been able to assess Minassian, but from what I've read, it does sound like he fully understood the impact of his actions. I mean, he was talking about wanting to be a famous killer and that he was glad that these people died. So he must have known on some level that he would have ended these people's life. And as I said before, he was pleased with the outcome. He had an intention, he had a plan, he went out of his way to hire this van and he followed his plan through. To give you another example, and I'm talking about a specific case that I've previously assessed, a man that I once assessed had a psychosis and he did something horrific. He killed his own 5-year-old child, but at the time he was hearing the voice of God telling him to do this, and he was also suffering from delusions, and he believed that if he did this, that both him and his child would be taken to heaven. So that is a case where somebody's not criminally responsible. That doesn't mean that the charges are just dropped and that's the end of the matter. The man still needs to go to a secure psychiatric hospital and needs long-term rehabilitation, but what I'm saying is he's not criminally responsible. Another example, which I think I talked about in my first episode, was a man who I assessed who had autism who stalked a waitress, and I found in my evidence that he didn't understand social cues because of his autism, and he couldn't understand that his interest, his romantic interest, wasn't reciprocated. So that's an example of somebody with autism who didn't have criminal responsibility. So the next question, I think, is, were the murders related to his autism? As I hope I'm getting across to you, criminal responsibility as an entity and as a concept is very different to being related to actions or offences. So very briefly, the main symptom clusters of autism are problems with social interaction, issues with verbal and non-verbal communication, and repetitive or ritualistic behaviours. That's just a very brief summary. If you want the details of the specific features and behaviours of autism, please check out my very first episode. I do think that there are some features of Minassian's illness which might have been related to his offending. For example, he may have felt more marginalised. It may have led to him more likely to be bullied, which we know he was, and potentially you could say that it might have led to him being rejected by women. For example, not understanding social cues, social reciprocity for flirting, as I illustrated in the case that I just mentioned. And you could possibly argue that because he had restricted interests, that may have made him more likely to be prone to obsess over mass killers and killing sprees. That last bit obviously is just a theory. I have no actual proof that that was his process. And this is the most important bit. All of those things are explanations of how Minassian's autism might have impacted some of his behaviour, but that's not the same as those being reasons to drive his intention of killing people. As I'm saying, they're two different concepts. So just to illustrate this difference, let's take an extreme example of somebody who doesn't suffer from a mental illness. Let's just say somebody has like a really bad lisp, and say that person is mocked relentlessly at school because he's got this lisp, and one day he snaps and he decides to go out on a killing spree. Obviously, we're not saying that the lisp caused the killing spree directly. Now, I'm being facetious here, and I'm not suggesting that a lisp is the same as having autism. Clearly it isn't. What I'm saying is I'm trying to illustrate the difference between relevant factors not being the same as causative factors. So as I said before, it's all about whether Minassian understood what he was doing at the time, and there are several indications that I've mentioned that suggest that he did. Similarly, on Twitter, there was a lot of attention on the cross-examination and specifically about Minassian's symptoms, such as his ability to engage in conversation. But I think that's all a red herring, because that only tells us about his diagnosis of autism, which is not under contention. Everybody agrees that he has autism. The point that we need to look at is about his criminal responsibility. And as I've said many times, these are completely separate entities. I think another interesting question is this: did Minassian fully understand the pain and the suffering that he caused his victims? The defense psychiatrist said he probably didn't, and I think on balance that's probably correct, because a lack of empathy and an inability to read other people or to understand other people's viewpoints are core features of autism. But again, I don't think that that's that relevant, because this is about the remorse that a defendant feels. It's again separate to the issue of criminal responsibility. The other thing I noticed is that a lot of people from Twitter seem to be indicating that having a mental illness in itself automatically is a medico-legal defense, but it's not. It's only the first step. First, you have to prove a diagnosis, and then you have to go through a whole process using a forensic psychiatrist such as myself to look at criminal responsibility. So I think another interesting question is this: should Autism Canada and its associated peers and autism charities have been offended by what the defense psychiatrist said? I think this is probably the most controversial part of this episode. So to quote again, what Autism Canada said was, "We publicly denounce the egregious claims made by a defence counsel psychiatrist who attributed Minassian's actions to his autistic way of thinking, which was severely distorted, similar to psychosis." Now, I do understand the angle that the autism charities are coming from. They are thinking correctly that it's quite callous and offensive to just simply group together psychosis and autism. So again, very briefly, autism is a pervasive developmental disorder that causes problems in social interactions, in verbal and non-verbal communications, and also leads to repetitive and restricted ritualistic behaviours. Whereas psychosis is like a break from normality, and it's usually in the form of hallucinations such as hearing voices, or delusions such as paranoid beliefs that other people want to hurt you. So anybody saying that the same two things is clearly wrong, but I don't think that is what the psychiatrist was trying to say. I think her words were misunderstood and it's been blown out of proportion. What I think the psychiatrist was saying was that Minassian's thoughts were disturbed in the same way that another person with psychosis thoughts can be disturbed. The disturbance was in a different way and the thought process was different, but both of them are situations where processes can be disturbed. I hope that makes sense. So I don't think she's saying they're the same thing. I think she's comparing one thing as possibly being in the same kind of ballpark in the way that it distorts thoughts as the other. The other thing I would say is that any forensic psychiatrist, including myself, their ultimate role only when they're giving evidence is to inform the court on matters it doesn't know. Whereas psychiatrists are, I think, obliged to be a champion for mental illnesses in general. I think in that one situation, she's there to inform the court. She's not there in any other role at that one moment in time. Her other work is a different matter. Anyway, so that brings me to the end of my long and potentially convoluted episode. Before you go, I've got a favour to ask you. I'd really appreciate it if you'd please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Not only does it help me out immeasurably, but it actually raises your IQ by a whole 10 points. I guarantee it. And also, I'm very grateful for the subscribers that I have and the views that I have, but I'd be even more grateful if we could have more comments. So tell me what you think about my videos. If you think that what I've said is wrong, let me know. I'm always open to look at things with an open mind. If you agree with me, let me know. You can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter as well, and you can submit any questions for me or any episode ideas in our email, which is psychforsoreminds@gmail.com. If you want to reference us on social media, use the hashtag PsychSore. Please tell your favourite people about Psych for Sore Minds. They deserve it. Spread the love. Until next time, stay 𝐸𝐵𝐲𝐜𝐡 homies, and please remember, I love you.